Hi, Stephen here. Just before we start, I wanted to tell you about an amazing project that we've been talking about for a couple of years. As you probably know, it's often hard for creative people in high demand groups. The film documentary called Witness Underground is about the experience of a group of young Jehovah's Witnesses who started an indie record label while still members of the group, and their stories of leaving and finding artistic expression in their new life. We've spoken to Scott Homan, the filmmaker, and Ryan Sutter, one of the artists featured in the documentary, and we hope to speak to other people involved in the project shortly. They've launched a Kickstarter campaign to get the film out there on the streaming apps, and they need our help. The link to their page is on our show notes, so check it out and see how you could support this important project. And now, the podcast. Hi, welcome to Cult Hackers. My name is Stephen, and I'm very, very happy to say that we have a really interesting guest today. We have Stephen Patterson. Stephen is a human rights lawyer with an interest in the intersection of faith, religious belief, and the rule of law. Welcome to the podcast, Stephen Patterson.
Yeah, good evening, Stephen.
So I mentioned that you're a human rights lawyer. Do you want to just expand upon that a little bit, please, Stephen? Tell us sort of what you do and how this relates to the topic of cults.
Yeah, it's been a little bit of a journey. I did a master's in international human rights law at the University of Essex 10, 12 years ago. I studied over there. And I have a faith background myself, so I'm a practicing Christian. And probably about 5 years ago, I came across a file, it was an odd file. It was a transcript of an interview of a middle-aged man who had left this faith community, leaving behind his wife and children. And as I read through the interview, all sorts of red flags started going off, and I realized that this had all the hallmarks of slavery, or modern day slavery, perhaps. But it also touched on my faith background, and so as a human rights lawyer, I started thinking about this and what could be done, because nobody had done anything up until this point. There had been numerous media reports on practices and quite sad things happening in this faith community, but that's where it stayed.
Okay, so you sort of heard about this story, and that tweaked your interest in this whole topic.
Yeah, very much so, because it touched on so many different aspects of human rights. Rights that we all take for granted, like the right to protect your children, to be a family unity, to be with your wife and children, and the freedom of movement, the freedom to express an opinion, the freedom to manifest religious belief, the right to have different opinions and views. Then there was just a whole bunch of the right to communicate with others outside. And then there was a whole lot of workplace exploitative practices that seemed to be occurring. And so the story of this man, and he's the subject of a documentary that's doing the rounds in different countries. It came out of Australia, New Zealand. It was in August last year. Yeah, it just touched on so many different human rights. And so I looked at it through the lens as a human rights practitioner, and trying to identify what could be done.
Okay, so what was this group then? Are you able to mention the group?
Yeah, so the group's name is Gloriavale. Certainly, if you Google that name in New Zealand or this part of the world, it lights up like a Christmas tree. I was abroad recently. I didn't actually take the effort to look it up, but you'll see that there's quite a lot of stories about them on YouTube, on the different media platforms around the world. It's just a Reader's Digest synopsis. It's a faith community that started 50 odd years ago, and it's has about 600 current members, about maybe 150, 200 have left, and it's primarily made up, I think, of about 8, 10 main family trees, if you will. They practice a belief that sort of stems out of what's known as the Anabaptist movement of 500 years ago from Zwingli and Zurich. So they've got some quite different views, perhaps, than mainstream Christianity, but a lot of it's not too far removed. Certainly on a theoretical academic basis, that is the case. In practice, quite different.
Yeah, that's interesting. So Anabaptism is something that I've stumbled across doing a bit of research into the sort of roots of groups like Jehovah's Witnesses, which is the group that I was raised in. And I recognize an awful lot actually about that, the doctrines and ideas that are around that. So I think the way of life is quite different. I do want to talk a little bit about that in a moment, but the beliefs around the end times and the end of the world and things you can and can't do and all of that, I think there's a lot of crossover there, lots of things I recognize, but they look very different, don't they? So I understand I interviewed Anke Richter going back a few months ago, and this is a group that she talks about in her book. Do you want to just describe the look and the way of life for these the people who have been in this group?
Yeah, so in this group, we went on a judicial view. So that's where the chief judge of the employment court took counsel for the defendants, Gloriavale and the Crown, and for the plaintiffs, being ourselves, for a site visit. And we saw 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, maybe they're 5, I'm not sure quite what age, young girls dressed in a blue dress going all the way down to the ankles, quite a plain dress, maybe a little white piece around the neckline, and I think that's probably all that they had. And then that dress they have for life. So obviously, and at some point, probably in their teenage years, they then are obligated to wear a scarf, a head covering. But they are trained from birth, effectively, from what they see. Their first image of a woman, a mother, their mother, other woman, is this blue dress. And at some point in those first few years, they put it on and they never take it off, so to say. That's their dress for life, except for when they get married, I think, or some special occasions, they might have a pink version. But yep, that's that. And the same for the boys. So the boys have a blue shirt, a blue trousers and boots, and that's their uniform for life too. Now, they have slightly changed 1 or 2 garments, I think, jackets and bits and pieces, but essentially that's what it is.
And the sort of beliefs, very sort of fundamentalist, I guess, and sticking to the Bible.
That's right. So they, believe in the Bible. They believe in the King James version of the Bible. They have then created their own rule book based on it. And that rule book is the leader's interpretation of the Bible. And the leaders are the sole arbiters of what the Bible means. We had a trial. We've had 2 trials, and the last one was a 10-week trial spanning 7 months in the employment court. And we got to look at all the aspects of power and control in this group. And a question was asked of one of Gloriavale's witnesses: are you free to believe something that's in the Bible which is different from what the shepherds have determined the Bible to mean? Are you free to believe that and stay in the community? And the answer is no. So there's no individual belief as such. It's a corporate belief, and it's a corporate belief as determined by the leaders. there is no room for individual critical thinking, own opinions, expressing those opinions, having questions, having doubts, without a whole lot of risk occurring for that person.
So who decides this? So this is the interpretation of
this is decided by the shepherds, which you might say like elders in a church, led by the overseeing shepherd, which is now Gloriavale believe that the overseeing shepherd sits in the palm of God. He is one of the 7 stars, I think, referred to in Revelation, the book of Revelation in the Bible. So he is the arbiter of a person's salvation. He must give an account to God for his flock. It's this incredibly powerful position.
And is this the individual that started the group, or has this been handed down?
Well, no. So we're on to leader number 3. So the first leader who founded it, and actually it might be good to go back and look at that group a bit. Hopeful Christian, and his name before that was Neville Cooper, an Australian. He came to New Zealand as an itinerant preacher, minister, and he took over what was known as a New Life Church. So partly Pentecostal, maybe it's quite Pentecostal, I'm not entirely sure. In a town called Rangiora, north of Christchurch in the South Island of New Zealand. And so it was an existing church, and he took it over, and then they moved 30 kilometres, maybe 40 kilometres into the country, but still on an intersection of a couple of main roads, crisscrossing a couple of rural North Canterbury towns, and people were living in the community. So he was the first one. Now, he went to jail for serious sexual offending. The Chief Justice of New Zealand, I'm not sure, can't remember the exact words he used, but basically, Justice Eichelbaum, Neville Cooper, Hopeful Christian, was beyond rehabilitation. He was, I think, sentenced to 7 years in jail. He served 11 months, which is a story in its own right. He died, I think, in 1995, maybe. And the next leader was Howard Temple. Howard Temple is still the notional overseeing shepherd, but he is, according to the papers reported, he is up on charges for sexual offending, and he is not permitted in the community under bail conditions. And so they have another acting overseeing shepherd. His name is Stephen Standfast.
Wow. So that's really interesting. So we have a sort of history of abuse within the leadership.
Yeah, and the way I look at it is, culture, organizational culture, business culture, it's led from the top. The leader sets the tone of the place. So if the 2 leaders that they've had have either been convicted or are charged with sexual offending, it's perhaps no wonder that this community has so many problems that it does have. So, for example, and I know we're sort of deviating a bit here, but the police conducted an operation called Operation Minneapolis 2 years ago, or a year ago. I lost track on the timeline there. And they found, according to the statistics, something like 70% of teenage boys were either perpetrators or victims of sexual abuse. And children make up the bulk of the population. I don't know what the number is, but I think out of the 600, 350 teenagers or younger.
Well, so my next question really was, once we get a background of the group and who they are, is what's the problem with them? What's the concern? And obviously that's one big one.
That's definitely one. I mean, another one obviously is exploitation of workers. So we've had 2 trials. We had our first trial called the Courage trial last year, and that was a 2-week trial. And these were 3 young men who alleged that they were employees and not volunteers. So the government had conducted an investigation and determined that they were volunteers, or not that they were volunteers, that they were not workers, not employees. Okay. And so we challenged that in the employment court, and the court found that they went to work from the age of 6 years. So they started work at 6 years of age, working in sphagnum moss out in the fields, working in some sort of the factories connected with it, doing farm work. But the work was more than incidental. So this wasn't work such that a normal schoolboy might do, helping mum and dad on the farm. This was long hours in a work gang situation, weekends, all day sort of thing. They were working long hours on top of their school hours. And then at school, at probably the age of 14, they were moved into a transition to work program, but actually it was, in reality, a placement in full-time work under the guise of some sort of work experience training. And then they were assigned where they would work, and that was that. There was no choice about what they could study. There was no choice about where they'd go to work. And sometimes they gave evidence of working 60-hour weeks on average, and sometimes they would work 72 hours non-stop to fulfill a production order. And the court found that they were employees. The court found that a child can be in an employment relationship, even from the age of 6 years, even if the actions of certain individuals in the community directing these boys might amount to some form of criminal offending, and that would obviously be for a different court to consider. That did not preclude an employment court providing remedies for people in slavery and slave-like conditions. Mm-hmm. So that was quite powerful.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So in a way, there was a risk that they'd kind of fall between the cracks there of different legal strictures, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, there was always the risk, that the evidence was insufficient for a criminal prosecution, and that might still be the case, and maybe there is no prosecution. That's not for us. That's for the police, if appropriate, based on the evidence. But in the employment court, it's a lower threshold. It's a balance of probabilities threshold, and we obviously met it.
Yeah, I guess the argument that you had to overcome was, if the children, they can't really be employed, and if they're not being employed, then you can't take them to court in an employment situation. So I guess that was the win, that you were able to demonstrate that even though they perhaps were too young, they were still employed.
Yeah, and what the court found was, for employment, there had to be a bargain, a contract, effectively, and what the boys got in return, they got accommodation, they got the necessities of life, they got food, they got clothing, they, and you might say that's not exactly adequate compensation, but it was the deal. They went to work, that's what they got back.
I suppose that was enough to then be able to say, yes, this is employment. So you you used employment rules and laws to score a win. That's really, really interesting. We've talked quite a lot about the way that many of these groups use free labour. So they're registered charities often, and they use free labour to do all of their activities, whether that be proselytizing or working in factories or whatever. So yeah, that's again pretty par for the course, I think.
Yeah, look, perhaps I should also just expand a little bit on Gloriavale. So Gloriavale is situated in the Southern Alps of New Zealand. It's geographically incredibly remote. There is next to no cell phone coverage where they're situated. It's maybe 1.5 hours, first part of a gravel road from the nearest town. Gloriavale controls their own transport fleet, so people, if you want to get out, it's quite an arduous journey, a complicated journey to get out, even if you've got the courage to do it. Gloriavale operates quite a number of businesses. It's a large financial enterprise. It's got dairy farms, which is quite prosperous in New Zealand at the moment. It's got a beekeeping factory. It's got a meal plant that produces pet foods and things for the European markets. They've been involved in oil exploration. Wow. They've got a school there. They've got preschools. They had not regional, but they had an airline that did flights and some commercial activities around the South Island. They've got an airstrip not that it looks very tidy, but in the property. They're busy people. There's a lot of money. So that's one aspect of it. I guess the other part I wanted just to elaborate on Gloriavale before we sort of carry on discussion is their business model, if you like, their organizational model is predicated on having children, lots of children. So one of their rules is procreation is mandated, contraception is prohibited. Young mothers are expected to have children as soon as biologically possible and to continue having them until God closes the womb. So we have families with 10, 12 children. What Gloriavale have been very adept at is structuring their financial and legal affairs to take advantage of the assistance of the state for mothers with children. So under our financial incentive for young mothers or mothers, having 12 children and next to or very, very little income makes a person entitled to significant government financial assistance. In Gloriavale, we're getting like $5 million a year from the government for having all these children. Well, not just for having the children, but also for the school and the preschool and the midwifery and all those associated with it. And the income generated by the men working in the commercial endeavours and enterprises is used to build up the equity and the asset pool of the community. And all of this is under the umbrella of a charitable trust. Well, the businesses are. And so this is a community not paying tax, receiving substantial government assistance, and people are, in my opinion, living in servitude.
Yeah, I was going to say all these children, if they're going to work at 6, it's not long before they're also contributing to the workforce. So there's another.
That's right. Yep. Yep.
Right. That sounds really really oppressive, and that's, I think, the worst example I've seen of this sort of thing happening.
Hi, I'm Tracy.
And I'm Sharon. And we are Feet of Clay, Confessions of the Cult Sisters. So way back in the 1970s, we became radical Christians in the Jesus movement.
We were promoted to leadership in the crazy cult commune Last Days Ministries, founded by none other than Christian music megastar Keith Green.
Now we're sharing our decades-long escape from the trauma and abuse of extreme Christianity.
We tell our own stories and also invite guests to talk about fundamentalism, purity culture, arranged marriages, child abuse, misogyny, homophobia, power-hungry patriarchy, and much more.
Much, much more. So join us as we share our journey of healing and humor and how we finally found peace and joy on the other side.
Feet of Clay, Confessions of the Cult Sisters, wherever you get your podcasts.
Did you know it's estimated that there are over 3 million podcasts currently out there? So trying to get noticed and grow listeners is really hard. If you're enjoying this podcast, why not tell a friend about it? We can be found on all the podcast apps, so please tell them to search for Cult Hackers. In fact, why not pause the show right here and do it now? You can find the pod link on our show notes, so you can just copy and paste it into a message or share it using your app. Could you talk a little bit about some of the people that leave and their experience? I guess you've spoken to some of those people. That's kind of the initial prompt to all of this. Could you talk a little bit about their experience?
Yeah, look, I've actually interviewed more people living inside the community than outside. I'm sure that is in itself a difficult statement for the leaders to get their head around how that could be, because compliant followers should not be talking to people like me.
Yeah.
And so I would meet people in interesting places. Obviously, I won't talk about that here.
Sure.
What I would say is one particular example early on, and it set the tone for what I was to come across. I was talking to a man. I was sitting in my car. He was beside the car on the side of the road, and we were chatting away. We'd made arrangements to meet, and we could hear a vehicle approaching maybe 1 to 2 kilometers in the distance. And the man looked up and he said, "It's one of the leaders." He gave the leader's name, and the sheer horror on his face. And he, with some certain things that he had with him, he jumped into the bush in terror, abject terror. And I don't know why, but I managed to take some photographs of the whole thing transpiring. And I look at these photos, and then, eventually he's completely hidden in the bush as this car approaches and then leaves, I guess. And I asked myself, how does a middle-aged man in a professional occupation live in such fear of another human being? And of course, there had to be something behind that. Why? A healthy faith community, nobody should have to do that. And so then all is not well.
Yeah, that's shocking. So where are we now then with this group? They're still going.
Yeah, so we had a second trial that finished in end of March of this year, and with the judgment I think came out in early July. I just think when I got back from Europe, and that was brought by 6 women, mostly younger women, but and a middle-aged woman, and they asked the court to determine whether they were also employees, and the court said yes, they were. In fact, when I looked through the chief judge's decision, in my opinion, it would support a finding of servitude. She found that these women were consigned at birth to this life. So their life was start work at 6 or 7, helping mum clean, cook, doing those sorts of things. And then as you get older, you do more hours before and after school, getting up at 2 or 3 in the morning to start baking bread or whatever you were doing in the kitchen. And then at 14, being yanked out of school and put on a team, a rostered team that might do cleaning or cooking or sewing in an industrial size operation. So we're talking tens of thousands or 10,000, meals a week sort of thing or more, right. or items of laundry to be washed and ironed. And then at an appropriate time, if and when the leaders determined, they would find you a man, you would get married. That was your lot in life. And as I said, the Chief Judge found, that was consigned to them by virtue of being born there and by virtue of being born a female. There was no choice. So, they were taught that from a young age, you obeyed the leaders. They saw what happened to those who did not obey those leaders. Boys were stood on stage and publicly shamed for wetting themselves at night, or denied food. People were denied food for days on end for misdemeanors.
So what sanctions are they receiving for these for these actions?
Well, so at this stage, the court have ruled that they were employees. just as they did in the earlier trial, in the Courage trial. Now we're at the stage of determining, well, who is the employer? Because Gloriavale have an incredibly complex legal and financial structure. So they have a whole bunch of businesses. Some are run through a business partnership. Some are run as limited liability companies. Some are run under the guise of a trust. Property is owned by a charitable trust. And yeah, so the question is who do you enforce this judgment against in terms of their employment entitlements for compensation for wages and other things?
So we don't know yet. I was going to say that there should be some back pay at very least for these people that have been doing all this work.
There's an awful lot of pay at stake here for them, and for all, not just for the 6 female plaintiffs and the 3 male plaintiffs, but all others who had the similar facts to them. And that's mostly everybody who's left Gloriavale has had to work the same way. So it'll be hard for Gloriavale to deny their claim.
So these six people that have brought this case, are they still a member of the community, or have they left the community?
They've all left. Yeah.
Right.
So they've left. Some have left a few years ago, and some in the last year.
Right. So that, I mean, I guess you really can't talk to that, but it's just as a passing thought. These people must be quite highly traumatized, and
absolutely. You know, I've worked with people when I've met them in the community. I mean, I started on this 4 years ago, and some of those are out. I think it's going to take quite some time, and for some of them, the trauma will be greater than others. Yeah. And you know, the trauma could be from sexual offending, being a victim of sexual offending, being the perpetrator of sexual offending within the norms of a community where that was okay. Disobeying the leaders was the cardinal sin. That being in possession of a cell phone was a worse infraction than unconsented sexual connection with another. That was the norms that these boys were raised in, which obviously is totally opposite to our societal norms and our rules of our land.
Yeah. That's terrible. And I guess it's typical of organizations that have such a religious organization, particularly, that have such a fetishization of sex and restrictions on sex and so on. They seem to have these behaviors that are just completely unacceptable.
And I go back to my earlier comment. You know, this came from the top.
Yeah.
The founder was a convicted sex offender.
Yeah.
His successor is up on charges.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so it sounds like you've been having your hands full, really, dealing with this particular case. What's your sort of wider thoughts around this balance between religious freedom and protecting the individual? Have you got any sort of wider thoughts about how we get that balance right?
Yeah, how do we get that balance right? That's a thorny question, and it's probably why governments are reluctant to intervene here.
Yes.
So, you know, if we let's say have a look at human rights. So we've got the right to religious belief and expression of opinion, and the right to receive information and to impart information. So those are individual rights, but there's also a right to manifest religious belief and in community with others. So rights are not absolute. So the obvious one is a religious group cannot form and say, well, we have the right to believe in child sacrifice, for example, which might have been practiced in some cultures recorded in the Old Testament of the Bible, example. So we go, no, there are limits. And those limits are usually what's justified in a free and democratic society and prescribed by law. So, and one of those limits would be is you can exercise your human rights, but they are subject to the laws of the land. And so in their Pilgrim decision, the last trial, the chief judge, said that the right to manifest religious belief is still subject to the laws of the land, including employment laws. So that would be one way of looking at it. Another way is your right to manifest your religious belief should not be at the expense of my right to my belief. You can't exercise your rights and then nullify every other person's right or some other person's right in the process. So there has to be limits. And I guess that's the real question is where are those justifiable limits? And what we're doing, so we have a case running in the Human Rights Court in New Zealand, is to ask the court, well, where are those limits? How far can a religious community or faith community go in exercising its beliefs and limit the human rights of its members? So does that mean a faith community can limit the human right of its members to freedom of movement? So in other words, can a faith community constrain its members from actually physically coming and going? Can it constrain its members from talking to any person? So freedom of information, communication. Can a faith community interfere in a family life? So going back to the very beginning, I talked about the man I met in the transcript of his interview where he was forced to abandon his wife and children. So that's an interference in the family. Is a faith community permitted to do that? So one way I think I'd look at that might be, I don't think it can, and I don't think it can under law. So if we look at the European Convention of Human Rights, Article 8, interference or protection of family and private communications and family life and home life. So I live in New Zealand, so I'm not familiar with the exact words, but in that sort of area.
Yep.
Under the European Convention of Human Rights, the state has an obligation not to interfere. That's pretty clear. It also has a positive, so that's a negative obligation, but also state also has a positive obligation, and that is to take measures to stop others interfering in that right. We don't have that protection in New Zealand. So we have protection in respect of communications and private information, but we don't have protections in respect of family life and home life. Well, certainly not to that same extent that you have in Europe. So where that becomes quite relevant is in the area of shunning.
I was going to ask about that. Yeah.
Because shunning at its core is an interference in the family life.
Yeah.
It's a tearing apart of a family unit. And to my mind, that engages Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights. Now, that's not the state doing it, but the question I'd be asking is, what steps have the state taken to stop others interfering in that right?
That's really interesting.
And then it gets harder because, well, what steps can the state do? Can the state go to, for example, Jehovah's Witness or Plymouth Brethren, exclusive Brethren, or if Gloriavale was hidden away somewhere in the UK, I don't know where that remote place might be, but say an island off the top of Scotland somewhere, could the UK government, could they go in and say, oh, you can't do that, you can't practice shunning because you are violating, well, if we don't take steps, we'll be violating Article 8 of the European Convention of Human Rights. Now, I'm not familiar with case law in the European Court of Human Rights in this area, but just in general principles, that's what I'd be looking at.
Right.
There's a similar protection in the one of the treaties that came out of the UN Charter. So that's the ICCPR, the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, Article 17, and that's in a similar vein, the non-interference in the family. And, maybe there is a legislative hole here in terms of protections in that area.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, there's some very egregious cases in relation to shunning, particularly for young people. So Jehovah's Witnesses baptize people anywhere between 8 and adulthood, really. So sometimes they're quite young when they're baptized, and at that point you come under the rule of the elders or the authority of the congregation, really, in terms of you can be punished for doing things that are considered to be wrong as soon as you're baptized. So there's some cases where children really are being shunned or are being isolated by these practices. Obviously some are less obvious, but I think some cases like that could that's really interesting, that would be a possible avenue to go down and test whether the government has a responsibility to protect that individual from those sorts of practices.
Yeah, I absolutely. I mean, just in that example you talked about, I think it would also engage the CRC, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. What's in the best interest of the child. And look, I'm not familiar with UK law or courts rather in their decisions, but in New Zealand, the courts will cite reference to that convention and the rights of the child. Certainly take that into consideration.
Yeah, that's very interesting. The UK government, the Conservative Party, are keen to, or some of the Conservative Party who are currently in power are keen to take the UK out of the European Convention of Human Rights, which is fairly terrifying, I think. But that's a political question. But I suppose as long as it's part of the law, then that's an avenue to go down. We also have coercive control laws. So there are laws that are used to protect particularly women from abusive relationships. So where a partner is abusing and coercively controlling a partner, there are laws to protect the partner for against those sorts of actions. And one of the things that we spoke to Alexandra Stein recently about this, and they're very keen at the Family Survival Trust to encourage the government to extend that from just intimate relationships to any relationship. As she makes the point, what's the difference? Is the same abuse. So I think that's an area that there's quite a lot of interest to try and I know some of the other things that have happened in Europe. I think in Norway is the removal of a sort of status. So different countries have different types of arrangements, but I think in Norway there's like an approved religious status, if you like, a bit like a registered charity, I guess. And I think one of the first things that we would like to do is to remove charitable status from organizations that practice some of these abusive things. You have the ridiculous situation where an individual might be being shunned by their family, and because they're a taxpayer, essentially they're helping to contribute to the organization that are doing these things to them. So that's another area of interest.
Actually, I'd just like to pick up on that. So just bear with me, but look, I'm not a cult expert at all. What I have observed, though, with Gloriavale, and I'm sure your listeners and yourself will probably be in a far better position than myself to validate it or critique it. So please do. But from what I've observed with Gloriavale, there are several pillars that are essential to the cult being formed and operating and continuing. So the first pillar I look at is, it needs people. It needs money, and then it also needs rules and some kind of structure. And when I say rule structure, you could perhaps throw ideology in there as well. Gloriavale started out when it came to people, it went around and it proselytized. And it typically went after those perhaps somewhat on the margins of society, not exclusively, but so it might pick up a solo mum. It might pick up a backpacker traveling the world on an overseas experience. It might pick up spiritual seekers. And so that's how it formed it took over a church, but that's essentially how it formed the first nucleus of its members. But obviously a group also needs money. So it encouraged the members to bring their income from their outside jobs into the community and hand it over. It also was quite clever. It encourage people to hand over all of their assets and their inheritances. And the founder went one stage further. He, by accident or design, I'll leave that to people to speculate, he arranged for his attractive daughters to marry the sons of a wealthy farm owner in the area, for which they then acquired the property. So now we've got money. And the third area is, well, it needs a structure of beliefs. And so the beliefs started evolving. They started having rules. So initially, everybody lived in their own house on the property. They just handed in their money at the end of the week or payday. They wore their own clothes. But then they started, they had religious teachings and all the rest. I likened that to the first phase. Then when they moved into the Southern Alps of New Zealand, where they are now, things look quite different. So they've moved from proselytizing to having recruitment by birth, internal birth. So their membership grew from their own families. They did not proselytize anymore. So it's all now internal. When it came to money, they're now getting money from the government under the Working for Families child support. These are millions of dollars coming in. And all the money is generated from their own businesses. So people aren't going out in the community doing their own thing. It's all controlled. And then they've now formalized their beliefs into a document called What We Believe. They've got their own rules. Everybody lives together in a hostel, so you don't have your own houses. Everybody wears the same uniform, so you don't have your own clothes. There's a common purse, so nobody has their own money, and so on. Now, the reason I mention all of that as context is because in dealing with Gloriavale, what we've had to look at is, okay, so what are the enablers here that enable this community to be formed, to operate, and to continue? And are those enablers all complying with the law of the land? So you mentioned the Norwegian example about the Charities Commission. So that might be one enabler. The businesses are operating under a charitable trust. Can we attack the charitable trust? And obviously in Norway, they've had a look at that maybe. And in New Zealand, we are continuing to plug away at the government. The government have been quite slow in coming to this. So that's one area. Another area in Gloriavale is the school, the children. So I mentioned before, there's hundreds of young children. They're all going to a school.
Yeah.
And because they go to a school, that means Gloriavale can control what they're taught, what they believe. It reinforces their doctrines and so on. So the question we have is the Gloriavale school operating in accordance with New Zealand law? Are there any issues with it? And so some former teachers and some former pupils have complained. They've complained to regulatory authorities who deal with teachers and the running of schools. And that led to, I think, the first principal being removed by order of the Ministry of Education because he had signed off the practicing certificate of a teacher who was convicted of sexual abuse, for example. And so it goes on. So you could look at, so the school is one of the organisations that underpins Gloriavale, and we're challenging that. We're challenging their employment practices. That's another pillar. But you all go around and say, well, what other enablers are there? So a community like that doesn't exist unless there's a bank there somewhere. So what's the bank's obligations? So the bank in New Zealand it is actually the Bank of New Zealand, BNZ, they announced they were going to withdraw banking services from Gloriavale because Gloriavale was breaching its human rights. And they, under their corporate social responsibility policies and responsibilities as a bank, could not be complicit in that as an enabler. So that's currently before the courts because Gloriavale have challenged that decision, and that's current ongoing. So that's another potential enabler. Another one will be the government. So what does the government know? And what are they doing in terms of their state duties under international law, where a state has treaties? So most countries have signed these various treaties. They could be International Labour Organization treaties dealing with exploitative practices. They could be the Civil and Political Rights Covenant of the UN. So that so the state can also be an enabler through its failure to act and the breaching its duties and to protect the citizen. I mean, the primary duty of the state is to protect the citizen. So that's another potential enabler. Businesses who buy from these communities that are engaged in coercive practices and breaching human rights might fall foul of some other international legal instruments. So this is now another area called the OECD. So if we look at human rights as an ecosystem, there is the ILO that deals with labour laws. We've got the UN with its various treaties, and then a third area is the OECD, and they've got one on multinational guidelines for multinational business enterprises, including a large section on human rights, and that has a claim process. It's a kind of an inquisitorial complaint process, and so companies engaging with these groups might run into a zone of legal risk in respect of that. So the way we look at Gloriavale is it's not going to be one thing in itself that unravels it. It's going to be slowly chipping away at all of these supporting structures and organizations, individuals, whatever, that enables them to continue.
That's really interesting. It's sort of how do you eat an elephant tactic, isn't it? One bite at a time.
One bite at a time. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think really good advice for any of us who are thinking about how to approach some of these issues. What would you say? Would it be possible for Gloriavale, let's use that group as the example, would it be possible for them to get their house in order? Could you ever see a time if they acknowledged the problems that they could change their ways and be left alone? What do you think?
Oh, look, I think my views vacillate over time.
Yeah, okay.
There are days when I think it's beyond redemption, and there are other days, but then I recognize there are people that have been there 50s, 55 years. They are now in their 70s, 80s. Where would they go? Yeah. They would be effectively refugees in their own country in their 70s. I don't think that's fair on them, even if they have made that choice. Those in that age bracket have chosen to join rather than those that have been born there. So yeah, I'm not too sure. If it was to be rehabilitated, it would take a lot of work. It would take a lot of work by a lot of government and private sector organisations. And I say private sector because the government are part of the problem. So asking the person or organisations who have been contributing to the problem as an enabler to then fix the mess is somewhat problematic. and you've got 50 years of indoctrination you have to unpack. Probably I want to just touch on that because that's why it's so hard. That's why these groups are so hard. So Gloriavale, the best way I could describe it is if you imagine two circles, you've got a member on one side and the leader on the other. And if you draw a line over the top from the member to the member has faith in the leader. They are appointed by God. They represent God for them, and in return, the member, if you like, draw a line back to leader draws a line back to the member. The leader provides them the rules for living, and in return, the member then says, "Okay, I'm going to obey you, the spiritual doctrines of unity, and I'm going to have absolute obedience to what you say and tell me to do." And as part of that bargain, that contract, if unofficial, informal contract, the leader assures them of their salvation. That's the deal going here. The problem with that deal is the moment you start saying, "I'm no longer going to obey you, I've got questions about your decision, or I've got a different belief," I've broken that circle. And what's at stake? My soul. My soul is now imperiled. I could go to hell. That paradigm, that circular deal that's going on between the member of that community and the leader is what traps them in there. It's like a prison in their brain. It's a psychological chain that holds them there. When you talk about reforming, you can reform all the practical things you like, but how do you reform that going on in the head? Because if you don't, what have you really done? If you change all the practical rules of how they do things, and the member still believes that leader holds the keys to their salvation, it will just morph itself into some other manifestation of how they live that out.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I've never, so far, I haven't seen a case where an organisation like that, a cultic group using coercive control, has been able to rehabilitate, because it's just it means turning your back on so many of the things that were part of that belief system and that you were indoctrinated into. It's very, very difficult. So yeah, I think it's hard to imagine. I think about the religion that I was born into, Jehovah's Witnesses, and I think what would make it okay. And actually, there's probably a handful of things. That's all that you'd want to see changed, including shunning and some of the medical things around blood transfusion, and obviously the way they handle cases of sexual abuse and so on. There's a bit of a shopping list, but it wouldn't be. It's not a huge list in many respects. But even then I can't see how those things could be turned around. They've prophesied the end of the world on numerous occasions, and it hasn't happened yet. But they still carry on saying Armageddon is around the corner. It's in their genes, really.
Yeah, Gloriavale have quite a good one. So they practice, and in fact, I grew up with this. So my father, I remember him saying this, once in church as a young boy. A brother does not take another brother to court.
Yeah.
So when I turned up into Gloria, in fact, I heard a lot of things I recognised from my youth. So I just thought, why do I know this? So they teach, and they at their communal dining table that Bible verse. Which is problematic, because if you have just experienced somebody sexually violating you, what do? Well, you can't go to the police. I mean, you don't have a phone and you don't have a vehicle to get in. But even if you could do all those things, well, how would you do that? Because you're going to be breaking what they've taught. So Gloriavale then have come up with a whole series of new policies, like, if these things happen, you go to the police. If this happens, we do all this. But at the same time, they still preach you don't go to take another brother to court. So if you're sitting there at the dining table and you hear this from the overseeing shepherd and you see the written policy, which one are you going to follow? You're going to follow the one that you were born with, the one that was knocked into you from 2 years old, the one that you watched people being publicly berated, physically assaulted, shamed, psychologically shamed for breaking. You're going to follow the rules that come from that, not the written paper, because you know that the written one is just for government appetite. And the sad thing is the government agencies look at this and say, well, they've got written policies. Right. It's all good.
Yeah.
They haven't grasped where the real intent lies.
Absolutely. There's a nod and a wink and an often unspoken, but sometimes actually spoken instruction that is one thing for the flock and a different thing for the rules, for the lawmakers. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Stephen, I've absolutely been fascinated talking to you. And I think, a lot of our listeners are interested in activism. They do activism and so on. And I think there's so many really interesting and important ideas. You've given us some signposts to point to. So I just want to say thank you so much for being on the podcast. Really appreciate it. Thanks for coming on the Cult Hackers podcast, Stephen Patterson.
Hey, Stephen, it's been nice talking with you this morning.